A few months ago, I kicked off a small series of videos looking at modules and how to achieve the best DPS through certain combinations, and it all started with this Poison Queen right here, Freyna. Now, since we've had a rework, an ultimate version of herself, and some brand new mods to throw into the mix, with some help from a friendly commenter talking about how mixing up skill power brackets achieves more damage, I wanted to put it into a test and have a look at as to really is the best way to max out your damage on Freyna. In this video, we'll be having a dive into all the mods on offer, but leaving out those brand new intensive crit mods, as Freyna only boasts a small 5% base crit rate, so you should never be building into crit unless this changes in the future. With that said though, insert a generic and witty reason for you to subscribe if you haven't already, and with that out of the way, let's get to it. Alright then, so one of the first things that we should be having a talk about is going to be the ground rules. This is going to be talking about how I've managed to make this a controlled environment, and there's a few things that we really need to kind of cover. First of all, we're going to be using Freyna at level 40. The reason why is because obviously her skills do manage to level up a little bit as you actually manage to go through. So in this case, all those skills are going to be maxed out at level 4, so we're going to be using those at the strongest that they can be. The enemy that is going to be shot at is going to be level 100 as well, so we're not going to try and mess about with those numbers. We're not going to try and try and fake you out by saying, "Wow, look at all these damage numbers on a level 1 enemy." So let's have a look at a level 100 so you can get an idea as to what's going to be going forward into the actual enemies and the fights that you're going to be taking part in. Another thing is the only mods that we're going to be looking at are going to be the ones that are going to be shown. These are going to be the only ones equipped, so there's going to be no cooldown, there's going to be no health, there's going to be essentially nothing that's going to affect the extra damage, and that includes Transcendence mods as well. So we're going to be looking at the base ability of that module and then seeing as to what kind of numbers it churns out. In terms of gear though, we're not going to be using Secret Garden, we're not going to be using a reactor that's powered up, so essentially we're going to use an off-type like version of a reactor, so that means we're going to use a different kind of like category. So if in this case we're not going to use a toxic one, it's not going to be mechanics either, so essentially we're not getting any kind of power boost ratios from this actual reactor, and we're also going to make sure that the ratios at the bottom do not actually go into the build as well. So essentially we're just looking at purely that 11,724 skill power, I think it is, that comes from a reactor, and that is all that's going to be churned out into all these abilities, so we're not going to do that. Now we will do something a little bit later on in the video talking about powered up reactors, but for the time being, in terms of base numbers, we want to essentially see what these skills can do, and that's the reason why I've chosen not to go through that route. Lastly, components wise, we're not going to use any kind of set that's going to be boosting up our damage. So in this case, we're going to be making sure we're not using Slayer and we're not going to be using Distorted Resolve. That way, you know, we can actually get a true test as to what the actual skill power from the reactor is doing, and that way we can actually see comparable numbers across the board for every single one of the skills. A little bit later on, we will talk about set bonuses, but for now, this is all just going to be base numbers. Alright then, so now that we've got that like legal jargon out the way pretty much for this video, we can now start talking about numbers wise. So what I will do is we're going to talk about skill 1, skill 3 and skill 4. There's no easy way for me to really test what skill 2 can actually do, to be able to do like the plague armor, because I don't believe we can actually get anyone in the laboratory to be able to shoot us back, and I want it to be a controlled environment, so therefore there's no chance of me being able to get that controlled out there in a mission. So in this case, we're going to just purely look at 1, 3 and 4, and we're going to look at the impact damage where applicable. So this is going to be our skill 1 as well as our skill 4. We're going to look at the damage over time across every single one of the abilities, and we're going to look at each of those damage over time numbers as well. So you might see a couple of numbers that are going to be the exact same, and the reason for that is because their modifiers are the exact same as well. But trust me, I've hand tested every single one of these. I've spent hours being able to get this information for you. So if you do appreciate this info and it does actually change some of your build, a like and subscribe really would be appreciated. So let's kick things off with skill 1. This is going to be the main ability you're going to be casting out and spamming left, right and center, and the reason why is because it does have the lowest cooldown out of all the abilities. Now, we're going to have a look at the base numbers first. So the impact damage, if you hit directly with this ability, is going to be 43,449 points of damage. The damage over time is going to be split into 3. We have Room 0 Trauma at 11,379. Toxic Puddle, which is going to follow that enemy around, is 9,698. And the Panic is going to be the unique form of poison that's going to be on this enemy, is going to be 10,556. Now, remember Room 0 Trauma as well as Panic, because you're going to see those numbers quite often going forward in terms of the rest of the skills, but just keep in mind that we're going to have those 3 active at the exact same time, ticking every single second, and it's going to be applying to all the enemies that are caught within that radius. Now in the past when we did these tests, we did see that skill power modifier was going to be king when it came to Freyna's damage over time, and the reason for that is because her base modifiers were ridiculously low, around about 30-40%, which meant that if you did put skill power into it, you were essentially kind of doing less damage than if you went into modifier. This is why going into tech specialist or going into focus on tech was really important when it came to Freyna. Now Soma, it's not as important, but it's still a really decent kind of like damage boost that we're going to see. So you will see that if we go into any of the power modifiers when it comes to the abilities, the actual impact damage with these things, because the modifiers are so high, you're not going to see so much of a return with the skill power modifier, but you will see that the damage over time will actually get a healthy boost. Either way, skill power is going to be constant across the board, as you can see the numbers on screen right now. So in this case, Technician, for example, is going to give us a 7% increase on our impact damage. When it came to our damage over time, though, it came anywhere between around about 27% to just shy of 32%, and that is going to be applied for all three of the abilities. Now, if we went for power increase, which is just a flat 65% increase to our skill power, because the modifiers are over 100% at base, this does mean that we get the full benefit of this, so that's going to be 65% increase across the board, so that's going to be impact damage as well as the damage over time. Now, of course, we can apply that for everything else that exists on this table, so as you can see on the numbers right now, you're essentially going to see anything that increases skill power is going to be given that exact same number across the board, but when it comes to modifier, you can see as to how this kind of messes about a little bit. One kind of thing to note about it is that Techmaster, for example, here, was a lot of fun to be able to mess about with, because that also gives you modifier as well as skill power, so that was kind of like a nice middle ground. I'm not going to recommend that later on in the video, but just so you know, for just purely looking at skill 1, just purely going off initial tests, Techmaster wasn't a bad shout. It actually does a nice little job of being able to find the middle ground between the two. But that's enough of skill 1, so let's start talking about skill 3. Now, this one doesn't have any impact damage, so this is purely going to be damage over time. So if you are going into skill power modifiers, you will see a bit more of a return on this ability compared to the other ones that we've actually talked about so far. In the case of skill 3, we will see swamp damage, which is going to be 12,237 points at base, room 0 trauma, once again at 11,379, and lastly decay, which is the unique form of toxic on this one, at 10,556. Once again, you're starting to see those common numbers. Now, like I said, because this is purely damage over time, you will actually see some nice returns when it comes to skill power modifier. So in the case of Technician, we're seeing anywhere between a 25 to a 29% kind of bonus on top of every single one of those damage numbers. But when it comes to power increase, once again, because all these numbers are over 100% base modifier, we're actually starting to see that we're getting that 65% across the board once again. And of course, this pretty much applies across the board for everything else that does exist. You can even see the toxic amplification as well, offering us a nice 65.4%, pretty much constant across the board. Once again, max skill being fantastic in this department, giving us the biggest increase at 87.6%. But toxic specialist, once again, is not a bad mod whatsoever, and is a really good kind of go-to for most people at 81.2% across the board as well. Now, I'm sure a lot of you are going to be interested in what skill 4 looks like, because obviously this is Freyna's unique weapon, this is going to be your ultimate, this is going to be your bosser, this is going to be essentially what takes down the stubborn target. So you want to know what's going to increase your impact damage, and then potentially a little bit to do with your damage over time, because not many people kind of focus too much on the damage over time with a skill 4. It is a nice damage increase, and it does kind of help out in terms of being able to get those boss melts, but it's more about the impact because we have so many rounds of this, and we want to know basically what kind of DPS we can crank out with this. So once again, it's pretty much the exact same kind of story as skill 1. In this case, the base amount of damage that this ability will do is 46,490 points. Room 0 trauma, you're going to guess it, 11,379. And nightmare, which is the unique form of toxic on this one, and yes, it is 10,556. So once again, you can see those common multipliers kind of coming into it. Now, what I will say is that in the case of Nightmare, as well as Decay and Panic, because these are unique forms of Toxic, or Poison in this case, because they are their own unique kind of statuses, you can essentially stack these. That's the reason why they've been named the way they have been. So you can apply basically 3 forms of that same damage multiplier. You can even apply 4 if you've actually got Plague Armor, and you actually manage to get hit, because that also offers the exact same form as well. Now, of course, like I said, similar story to skill 1, anything that's going to increase your damage modifier is actually going to be giving you very small returns when it comes to the base impact damage of this ability, but it will help you out with the damage over time. And none of this is more true when it comes to looking at Technician, because this is going to give you an extra 6.6% increase on the amount of damage you're doing with your impact. So every single bullet is only going to do an extra 6.6%. Now, in my mind, that's not really worth the slot. I think there are many other things that can actually benefit. So if you are struggling for module spaces and everything like that, I wouldn't put Technician. Obviously, you're not going to put Technician in it anyway. There are much better options, but still, only offering a 6.6% boost on your actual impact damage is just not really worth it in my opinion. But then when it comes to like the actual damage over time, we can see that Room Zero Trauma and Nightmare get around about a 27 to 29% kind of damage increase, and that alone is actually a decent kind of increase by itself. Obviously, power increase and anything that's going to increase your skill power is going to give you the biggest increase here, so 65% across the board, and it just kind of gives you a nice kind of like chunk when it per every single one of those impact damage, as well as obviously your damage over time, which is really, really nice to see. So now that we've got all that out of the way, after we've got all the base numbers, what I've then done is put it into a table, and then I've sorted them by their own separate mod types, and then I've sorted it even further by the amount of damage that we're going to do from the impact. Obviously, this is going to be going off skill 1, but if you are looking to kind of look more towards the damage over time side of things, it is still pretty much following the exact same order. The only thing that does change is that Tech Master is better than Power Increase, but since these are the two bottom options when it comes to battle mods, it's just not really worth it, to be fair in my eyes. So you'll probably be looking at Focus on Toxic or Toxic Specialist before you start going into something like Tech Master. Now, of course, you're not really going to be sorting your build purely based on this. You're not going to be putting one single mod in. You're not going to be going, yep, that's the amount of damage that my build can do, and just leave it there. So what you can do is obviously do combinations of mods, and in the case of when it comes to the amplification mods, because these take place instead of the actual critical strike or critical hit mods, what you can do is put both the tech and the toxic amplification mods on, and then you can start increasing them with extra mods on top of it. So what I've done is I've put both of the amplification mods on my build. I've then started looking at the individual mods once again, so in this case I've managed to narrow it down to 7, so I've got it down to Technician, Focus on Tech, Max Power, Toxic Specialist, Toxic Master, Power Increase, and Max Skill. So what I wanted to do with these ones is basically just get an idea as to which would be the best, like the cream of the crop, when it comes to impact damage, as well as that extra damage over time. Now, of course, because of Toxic Amplification, we're actually getting a really nice power increase when it comes to skill power, even if we do go into Technician, because that 65.4% increase to our Toxic skill power is really, really nice. And that does mean if you go for Technician, you will see a 91.2% increase to the amount of damage that you're going to do with your impact of your skill 1. And then when it comes to your damage over time, you'll see anywhere between 164% to around about 181% increase, which is quite nice. But obviously there are much better options, and that's what we're going to focus on with the rest of the list. As you start making your way down, obviously the better mods here are going to be the battle mods, because battle is going to give you skill power rather than skill power modifier. So therefore going for something like Toxic Specialist, Toxic Master, Power Increase, and Max Skill is going to give you a better return. In this case, Toxic Specialist actually worked out to be the worst of the options, which really took me by surprise, because most people do tend to actually kind of like go towards Toxic Specialist as like a baseline for Freyna. And if you start adding it in with Toxic Amplification, even though it's giving you more toxic skill power, it ends up being less damage, and the reason why is because of those buckets, because of the way the damages are kind of calculated. Having a mixture of skill power, which is just generic skill power, and toxic skill power gives you more damage, and you can't really see this unless you actually look into that of Power Increase and Max Skill, and as you can see, these are the two best options that do exist. Now, unfortunately for us, in the case of Max Skill, this is going to come with the downside of that plus 50% to our cooldown, which is kind of too much. It destroys most of what Freyna is going to be doing. Now, obviously, you can kind of offset it a little bit with things like Nimble Fingers and being able to go for MP conversion or whatever it was, the other one, basically the cooldown mods. But there's only so much that you can get cooldown wise going towards it, and I think it kind of caps out if you don't go for the focus on mods around about, it's just over 60% if I remember right. So adding in this mod so that you now only have a minus 10% is way too much. It makes Freyna slow, it makes her too bad when it comes to mobbing. It's just not worth it, and it really kind of does destroy her ultimate as well, because that already has a long cooldown. So while the damage is nice, unless this actually gets a change to go down to something like 25% instead of 50, it's just not worth rocking, unless you're going for some kind of bossing build. So if you are going into Colossus fights, then maybe max skill actually is quite viable over there. Instead though, power increase is the next best option, and that is actually going to be cranking us out to almost a 200% increase to our impact damage on our skill 1, which is quite fantastic. And then when it comes to our damage over time, because we've got the extra modifiers from the tech amplification as well, this is cranking out to anywhere between 260% to around about 277% increase on the damage over time. But that is just purely looking at combinations of 3 mods. What if we were taking that a step further and we were actually going to chuck this into a build? That means that we're going to be adding both of the amplification mods, we're going to be adding in a fully mounted reactor as well, with ratios that are going to be helping us out in terms of damage, full distorted resolve set at deathless, so that's going to be a 1 HP build, so we get the full toxic power as well. And this is essentially what we're going to see. I've managed to narrow it down to 5 best options, so 2 attack mods and 3 battle, but as you can see, essentially power increase and max skill are the best options to go for. Like I said, if it wasn't for max skill having such a negative downside, it would be absolutely fantastic to be able to chuck in here, but that does mean that power increase is our next best option, being able to not have that cooldown penalty as well. And then we kind of take this a little bit further, because obviously we can combine this with an attack mod as well. So I've combined this with Tech Specialist just to get an idea as to, like, if we did increase the modifier even further, what kind of return would we actually see. And in this case, you will see less than a 4% increase when it comes to the impact damage of your skill 1, but it does give you a nice chunky increase of around about 23 to 27% increase on your damage over time. So if you do have the space, I do think that being able to go for Tech Specialist for mobbing runs is fantastic, but if you are going into a bossing build, it's probably just not worth it, and you could probably use that slot elsewhere. Now lastly, I did have an afterthought, and that was going to be using Venom Injection, because this mod is fantastic, being able to increase your skill power modifier as base just from being able to have this active. So I once again wanted to pair this up with everything else that we've already talked about, and I just wanted to have a look at power increase by itself, as well as what happens if we do go for Tech Specialist and power increase, and see if we actually get even less of a return being able to go for that mod. One thing to note with these numbers, as I do pop them up on the screen, is that the toxic resist reduction from Venom Injection potentially is affecting these numbers, so it's not really going to be a like for like, but the numbers that you will see on the board will be ones that you will actually see out in the battlefield as well. So that's going to be, if you were comparing the two in that kind of sense, then obviously you can make that kind of comparison. Otherwise, yes, it's not a like for like, but it is going to be more realistic for what you see out and about. In this case, power increase, once again, is still fantastic. The Venom Injection is only giving you a 2.5% increase on the actual impact damage of your skill 1, so it's not really worth it in that kind of sense, but it does help massively when it comes to your damage over time. And the exact same can be said once we introduce Tech Specialist into here, going from, instead of a 27.86% increase on Room 0 Trauma, we're now getting closer to 60%. So if you do have the space, if you're looking for a mobbing build, then Tech Specialist and power increase is going to be the way to go with Venom Injection, and this is going to be the most amount of damage that we're going to actually crank out when it comes to mobbing builds. So if you are looking for a nice balance between mobbing as well as being able to take down those elites that we see at the end of the 400%, then I do think that Tech Specialist or Focus on Tech with power increase, with Venom Injection, with everything else that we've talked about with the amp mods, full reactor, full distorted set, and 1 HP, this is going to be the most amount of damage that we're probably going to be able to crank out in this game, bar going for that max skill because of that cooldown reduction. But essentially that's my summary. This is my way that I'm going to be running my builds, and in fact I'm actually going to be making a build video based on the numbers and the stats that we found here. So this is the section I want to hear from you. How are you still finding the First Ascendant? Are you still looking forward to Season 2? And how do you currently run your Freyna? With the information that I've just provided here, will you be changing any of your catalyst slots so that you can start fitting in something like power increase, or being able to slot in something like Tech Specialist or Focus on Tech? Let me know all that and more down below. Lastly, if you also want to be able to leave a comment if you like these DPS breakdowns, if you want to see more now that we've got extra mods to be able to see how as to what is the best way to set up Descendants, let me know in the comment section down below which is the next Descendant you would like me to be able to cover. I've got Isomo on my radar. I would like to be able to mess about with the extra skill power, but I'm happy to take suggestions from the comment section. Massive thank you for making your way to the end of the video, and as I always say, keep yourself safe, keep yourselves well, and I'll see you all on the next video.